The graduation gown hung on the back of Jake's bedroom door, a symbol of achievement that should have filled him with pure joy. Instead, as he stared at the black polyester fabric with its royal blue trim, he felt a familiar knot of resentment tightening in his chest. 4 years of relentless work, countless sleepless nights, and sacrifices that nobody in his family seemed to notice or care about had led to this moment. May 18th was supposed to be his day, the culmination of everything he had fought for while his older sister Ashley glided through life on a cushion of parental support and unconditional approval. Jake turned away from the gown and sat on his bed, the same twin mattress he had slept on since middle school. His room was small, cramped with textbooks, and the detritus of a college student who had never quite left home, not by choice but by financial necessity. While Ashley had enjoyed a fully funded apartment near her university, complete with a monthly allowance for groceries and entertainment, Jake had commuted from this very room, working 2 jobs to cover tuition that his parents insisted he should handle himself because it would build character. The memory of his freshman orientation flooded back unbidden. He had been so excited, so full of hope, ready to embrace the college experience he had dreamed about throughout high school. That first week, he had received 3 invitations to study groups, 2 party invites, and an opportunity to join an intramural soccer team. He had accepted them all, carefully writing the dates and times in his new planner, imagining the friendships he would forge and the memories he would create. Then his mother had called. Ashley needed a babysitter for Friday night. Just this once, she had promised. Ashley and her husband Brad deserved a date night, and family helped family. Jake had canceled on the study group, telling himself it was no big deal, that there would be other opportunities. But the pattern had established itself that very first week, a template that would repeat itself hundreds of times over the next 4 years. The requests had come with increasing frequency and decreasing notice. Could he watch the kids on Tuesday? Ashley had a hair appointment. Could he take them for the weekend? Ashley and Brad needed couple time. Could he pick them up from school? Ashley was tired. Each request was framed as a favor, a temporary inconvenience, but they accumulated like stones in a backpack, weighing him down until he could barely move forward. Jake loved his nieces and nephew. Emma, the oldest at 7, had his same curious nature and love of books. 5-year-old Tyler was energetic and funny, always making Jake laugh even on his worst days. And little Sophia, just 3, would curl up in his lap and fall asleep during movie nights, her tiny hand clutching his shirt. They were innocent in all of this, and his resentment never touched them directly, but it poisoned everything around them. He remembered the night he had missed his 20th birthday celebration because Ashley had called at the last minute, claiming an emergency. Marcus and Sophie had planned a surprise party, coordinating with a dozen of their friends. Jake had been getting ready, actually looking forward to something for once, when his phone rang. Ashley's emergency had turned out to be tickets to a concert that Brad had surprised her with. She had known about Jake's birthday but had asked anyway, and he had said yes because saying no to Ashley was something nobody in the family did. The financial disparity had been the hardest pill to swallow. Jake had watched his parents write check after check for Ashley's education, her wedding, her down payment on a house. They had paid for her dream wedding at a vineyard, 300 guests, an open bar, and a honeymoon in Hawaii. When Jake had asked for help with textbooks his sophomore year, his father had lectured him about responsibility and the value of earning your own way. He had earned his own way, 2 jobs throughout college, sometimes 3 during summer breaks. He had worked retail, waited tables, tutored high school students, and done freelance graphic design work at 2 in the morning because those were the only hours he had free. His GPA had suffered, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked time. While other students pulled all-nighters studying for exams, Jake pulled all-nighters working shifts and then went straight to those exams exhausted and unprepared. The family dinners were the worst. Every Sunday, they gathered at his parents' house, and the conversation inevitably centered on Ashley's life, her children, her struggles as a mother. Jake's achievements were footnotes, mentioned briefly if at all. When he made the dean's list despite everything, his mother had smiled and said that was nice, then immediately pivoted to discussing Emma's performance in her school play. When he landed a competitive internship, his father had grunted approval before asking Jake if he could help Ashley move some furniture that weekend. Last Sunday's dinner had been the breaking point, though Jake had not fully realized it at the time. They had been eating his mother's pot roast, the same meal she made every week, when Ashley had mentioned her upcoming couples retreat. She had been so excited, describing the spa treatments and the gourmet meals, the hiking trails and the couples therapy sessions that the resort offered. The retreat was scheduled for May 17th through the 19th, and she had already arranged everything. Jake had felt the blood drain from his face. May 18th, his graduation day. He had mentioned it dozens of times, had sent calendar invites to the family group chat, had reminded everyone at every Sunday dinner for months. His mother had looked up from her plate with a concerned expression, asking who would watch the children, and Ashley had turned to Jake with that expectant smile he knew so well. That smile assumed his compliance, his availability, his willingness to once again put his life on hold for hers. In that moment, sitting at the dinner table with pot roast growing cold on his plate, Jake had understood something fundamental about his place in this family. He was not the golden child. He was the shadow, always present but never truly seen, valued only for what he could provide to make Ashley's light shine brighter. The living room had always been the stage for important family discussions, though Jake had learned over the years that discussion was a generous term for what actually happened in that space. His parents sat side by side on the leather couch they had purchased after Ashley's wedding, a gift to themselves for successfully marrying off their eldest child. Jake took the armchair across from them, maintaining physical distance that he wished could translate into emotional protection. His mother's phone sat on the coffee table. Between them, speaker mode enabled, Ashley's presence hovering in the room like an invisible judge. His father cleared his throat in that particular way that signaled the beginning of a pronouncement rather than a conversation. The late afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the carpet. Jake's mother smoothed her hands over her knees repeatedly, a nervous gesture that might have seemed like anxiety, but Jake recognized as the preparation for battle. They had called this meeting with less than 24 hours' notice, a text message that simply read, "Family meeting tomorrow at 4. Important." The preamble was brief. Ashley needed them, the children needed stability, and family took care of family. These were the pillars of their argument, presented as unassailable truths rather than debatable positions. His mother spoke about the importance of the couple's retreat, how Ashley and Brad had been struggling lately, how crucial it was for them to reconnect and strengthen their marriage for the sake of the children. His father nodded along, adding that sometimes sacrifices were necessary, that being an uncle meant stepping up when needed. Jake waited for them to finish, watching their mouths move and hearing the words but feeling strangely detached from the scene, as if he were observing it happen to someone else. When the silence finally came, expectant and heavy, he spoke two words that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. "No. Sorry." His mother blinked rapidly, her head tilting slightly as if she had misheard. His father's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something darker. Through the phone speaker, Ashley remained silent, but Jake could hear her breathing, could imagine her in her pristine kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, listening to her little brother commit the unthinkable act of refusing her. The word sorry had been automatic, a reflexive politeness that Jake immediately regretted. He was not sorry. He had given them months of notice about his graduation, had reminded them repeatedly, had made it abundantly clear that May 18th was non-negotiable. But his mother latched onto that sorry like a lifeline, her expression softening into what she probably thought was understanding, but looked more like condescension. She began the guilt campaign with practiced ease. Family loyalty was not just a phrase but a responsibility, a sacred bond that held them together through difficult times. Had Jake forgotten all the times they had been there for him? Had he forgotten who had raised him, fed him, given him a roof over his head? Her voice took on that particular tremor that had worked on him for 22 years, the suggestion of tears without actual crying, the implication that his refusal was causing her physical pain. Jake felt the familiar pull of guilt, that old familiar hook that had caught him so many times before. But something had shifted. Since that Sunday dinner, he had spent the past 2 weeks thinking, really thinking about his place in this family and what he was willing to accept going forward. He had looked at his graduation gown every morning and asked himself what it represented. Just a piece of fabric and a ceremony, as his family seemed to believe, or the culmination of 4 years of struggle that deserved recognition and celebration. He interrupted his mother mid-sentence, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He reminded them about the calendar invites, the dinner conversations, the countless times he had mentioned May 18th. He pulled out his phone and began reading dates and times, a litany of evidence that they could not deny. His mother waved her hand dismissively, claiming she had not seen those messages, that things got lost in the shuffle, that surely he understood how busy they were with Ashley's children. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that Jake might have doubted his own memory if he had not prepared for this exact tactic. He had screenshots ready, emails with read receipts, text messages with timestamps. But his father cut him off before he could present them, his voice rising in volume and authority. This was not about messages or calendars. This was about priorities and what really mattered in life. A graduation ceremony was just a formality, his father declared. The degree would arrive in the mail regardless of whether Jake sat through some boring speeches in an uncomfortable gown. Ashley's marriage, on the other hand, was a living thing that required nurturing and attention. Her children needed stability. Did Jake really value a few hours of ceremony over his sister's happiness and his nieces' and nephews' well-being? The false equivalency was stunning in its audacity. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but his father was not finished. The threats came next, delivered with the casual certainty of someone who had never had his bluff called. If Jake was going to live under their roof, he needed to contribute to the household in meaningful ways. If he could not do this one thing for his sister, perhaps it was time to reconsider the living arrangement altogether. The word eviction was never spoken, but it hung in the air like smoke. Through it all, Ashley remained silent on speakerphone. Jake stared at the device, willing her to speak, to acknowledge that this was her request, her retreat, her children. But she said nothing, letting their parents wage her battle while she maintained plausible deniability. It was a coward's tactic, and it crystallized something in Jake's mind about who his sister really was beneath the surface of family dinners and holiday photos. He stood up slowly, his legs steadier than he expected. The words came from somewhere deep inside, a place that had been building strength in silence for 4 years. He would be at his graduation. This was not negotiable. They had known about the date for months, and their failure to prioritize it was not his emergency to solve. Ashley needed to hire a babysitter like every other parent who wanted a weekend away. He was done being the family's unpaid childcare service. His mother gasped as if he had slapped her. His father's face turned red, his mouth opening to deliver what would surely be an ultimatum of his own. But Jake was already walking toward the stairs, his heart pounding but his resolve solid. Behind him, Ashley finally spoke, her voice tight with anger, asking how he could be so selfish. Jake did not turn around. He climbed the stairs to his small room, closed the door, and sat on his bed, shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and the weight of what he had just done. The passive-aggressive notes began appearing the next morning, small squares of paper that his mother left in strategic locations like landmines waiting to detonate. The first one Jake found was taped to the bathroom mirror, written in his mother's careful, cursive, "Family is forever. Grudges are temporary. Choose wisely." He crumpled it without ceremony and threw it in the trash, but more appeared throughout the day like a paper trail of guilt. One on the refrigerator handle, another tucked under his car's windshield wiper, a third slipped under his bedroom door while he slept. His father's silent treatment was somehow worse than the notes. The man moved through the house like Jake had become invisible, looking through him rather than at him, leaving rooms when Jake entered them. At dinner, his father would ask his mother to pass the salt even when Jake sat closer to it, creating elaborate workarounds to avoid acknowledging his son's existence. The silence was a weapon his father had perfected over the years, deployed whenever someone in the family stepped out of line, and Jake had watched it used against Ashley exactly once, years ago, when she had briefly dated someone their parents disapproved of. She had capitulated within 3 days. Ashley's texts arrived in waves, each one more manipulative than the last. The first few were angry, calling him selfish and accusing him of not caring about family, When those failed to generate a response beyond Jake's brief replies that his decision was final, she shifted tactics. The messages became softer, sadder, filled with implications rather than accusations. Emma had asked why Uncle Jake did not want to see them anymore. Tyler had drawn him a picture at school. Sophia kept asking when Jake was coming over. Each text was a small knife, carefully placed to hit the softest parts of his resolve. Jake loved those children genuinely and completely, which made Ashley's weaponization of them particularly cruel. He knew she was lying or at least exaggerating. Emma was 7 and understood that adults had jobs and responsibilities. Tyler was too busy with kindergarten and soccer to pine for anyone. Sophia was 3 and lived entirely in the present moment. But the texts still worked their dark magic, making him question whether standing firm was worth the cost, whether his graduation really mattered more than disappointing 3 innocent kids who had never asked to be pawns in this family drama. Wednesday evening brought unexpected relief in the form of Aunt Linda's phone call. His mother's younger sister had always been the family outlier, the one who had moved 3 hours away and visited only for major holidays, maintaining a cordial distance that Jake had never fully understood until now. Linda's voice on the phone was warm and knowing, asking Jake how he was holding up with a specificity that made it clear she knew exactly what was happening. They met for coffee the next morning at a shop near campus, far enough from home that Jake did not have to worry about running into his parents. Linda looked like an older, wearier version of his mother, but her eyes held something his mother's lacked, a recognition of pain that came from experience rather than observation. She ordered them both coffee and a slice of coffee cake to share, then asked Jake to tell her everything. The story poured out of him in a rush. 4 years of resentment and frustration condensed into 30 minutes of uninterrupted confession. Linda listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, her expression growing darker as Jake described the pattern of last-minute requests, the financial disparity, the casual dismissal of his achievements. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and sighed deeply, a sound that carried decades of her own accumulated disappointments. Linda shared her own story then, pieces of family history that Jake had never heard. She had been the responsible one growing up, the daughter who stayed home to help with aging grandparents while his mother, the golden child even then, had gone off to college with full parental support. Linda had eventually made it to college 2 years later, paying her own way and graduating with honors that nobody in the family had bothered to attend. She had learned early that some family dynamics were set in stone, that fighting them was exhausting, and that sometimes distance was the only path to peace. The validation Jake felt hearing Linda's story was profound and unsettling. Part of him had always believed that maybe he was being too sensitive, that perhaps his parents' favoritism was not as extreme as it seemed, that he was imagining patterns that did not really exist. But Linda confirmed everything, adding details he had been too young to notice or remember. Ashley had always been the favorite, even as children. Their mother had made excuses for Ashley's poor grades while demanding perfection from Linda. Their father had funded Ashley's first car while Linda had taken the bus. Linda reached across the table and squeezed Jake's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. She told him that standing up for himself was not selfish but necessary, that boundaries were not punishments but protections, that he deserved to have his achievements celebrated just as much as Ashley's were. She promised to be at his graduation, front row, cheering loud enough for the whole family. The relief Jake felt was so intense it brought tears to his eyes, which he quickly blinked away, embarrassed by the display of emotion. That evening, Jake met Marcus and Sophie at their favorite pizza place near campus. A dingy spot with questionable health code compliance but incredible food, and a tolerance for broke college students who nursed single slices for hours. Marcus had been his roommate freshman year before Jake had been forced to move home to save money, and Sophie had been in his introduction to psychology class sophomore year, their friendship slowly evolving into something more over shared study sessions and late-night conversations. He told them everything, including the conversation with Aunt Linda. Marcus listened with growing anger, his usually cheerful face darkening as Jake described his parents' behavior. Sophie held Jake's hand across the sticky table, her thumb tracing circles on his palm in a gesture of comfort that made his chest ache with gratitude. When he finished, Marcus launched into a passionate speech about toxic family dynamics and the importance of self-respect, punctuating his points by stabbing the air with a slice of pepperoni pizza. Sophie was quieter but no less supportive. She reminded Jake that love should not require self-destruction, that real family lifted you up rather than tearing you down, that his parents' inability to celebrate his achievements said everything about them and nothing about his worth. She had met his parents twice, both brief encounters that had left her with a bad impression she had been too polite to fully articulate until now. She described the way his mother had dismissed his Dean's List achievement during their first meeting, the way his father had interrupted Jake's story about his internship to take a call from Ashley. Marcus suggested Jake start looking for apartments, a practical concern that Jake had been avoiding because it felt like admitting defeat. But Marcus framed it differently, not as running away but as running toward something better, creating space for himself to grow without the constant weight of family expectations crushing him. Sophie pulled out her laptop, and they spent the next hour scrolling through rental listings, finding possibilities that seemed impossibly expensive, but Marcus insisted were manageable with Jake's new job offer. The job offer was another point of pride that his family had barely acknowledged. Jake had accepted a position at a marketing firm that specialized in nonprofit work, exactly the kind of meaningful career he had dreamed about when he started college. The salary was modest but livable, enough to afford a small apartment if he was careful. His parents had responded to the news with lukewarm congratulations before immediately asking if the job was flexible enough to allow for occasional babysitting. Friday brought another barrage of texts from Ashley, these ones more desperate. She accused him of ruining her marriage, of being vindictive, of punishing her children for something that was not their fault. Jake read them with a strange detachment, recognizing the manipulation tactics that had worked on him for so long, but feeling their power diminish with each message. He showed them to Sophie, who read through them with clinical interest, pointing out each guilt trip and false equivalency like a professor analyzing a case study. That night, Lying in his childhood bed with his graduation gown hanging on the door like a promise, Jake made his final decision. He opened the family group chat, that digital space where his mother shared inspirational quotes and his father forwarded bad jokes, and Ashley posted endless photos of her children. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard for a long moment, composing and deleting several drafts before settling on the simplest version of his truth. The message was direct and unambiguous. I will be at my graduation. This is not negotiable. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then turned off his phone and stared at the ceiling, his heart racing but his mind clear. Tomorrow was Saturday, 1 week until graduation. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences his family chose to impose, Jake knew he had finally drawn a line that he would not allow them to cross. The breaking point had not broken him, but had instead revealed what he was capable of when he chose himself first. May 18th arrived with cruel sunshine streaming through Jake's bedroom window. He woke early, instinctively listening for sounds of his parents preparing breakfast, the familiar clatter of dishes that usually marked Saturday mornings. The house was silent. He checked the driveway from his window and found it empty, both cars gone. They had left before dawn, choosing babysitting duty over their son's graduation without even a goodbye note. The sting was sharp and immediate, a physical pain in his chest that made breathing difficult. Part of him had hoped, despite everything, that they might change their minds at the last moment. That hope died in the empty driveway. Jake sat on his bed for several minutes, staring at his graduation gown, wondering if his father was right, if this was just a formality, a meaningless ceremony not worth the family warfare it had caused. Then his phone buzzed. Aunt Linda, leaving now, so proud of you, see you soon. Marcus, big day, we're bringing signs. Sophie, you've earned this, can't wait to celebrate. The messages kept coming, a chorus of support that pushed back against the silence of the empty house. Jake stood, showered, and dressed with renewed determination. The ceremony was held in the university's outdoor stadium, rows of folding chairs arranged on the football field, families crowding the bleachers. Under a cloudless sky, Jake found his place in the alphabetical lineup, surrounded by classmates he barely knew, people who had enjoyed the traditional college experience while he worked and babysat. But when he scanned the crowd, he found his section immediately. Aunt Linda and Uncle Tom in the front row, his cousins beside them, Marcus waving a homemade sign that read "Jake did it," and Sophie holding flowers, her smile visible even from a distance. When his name was called, they erupted. Aunt Linda's whistle pierced the polite applause. Marcus shouted loud enough to embarrass nearby families, and his cousins stomped their feet on the metal bleachers, creating thunder. Walking across that stage, shaking the dean's hand, accepting his diploma, Jake felt tears threatening. Not from sadness, but from the complex cocktail of emotions he had carried for 4 years. Pride in what he had accomplished despite everything, grief for the family support he had never received, and liberation from the obligation to keep sacrificing himself for people who would never appreciate it. The celebration afterward at an Italian restaurant was joyful and loud, his chosen family filling a private room with laughter and stories. Aunt Linda gave a toast that made Jake's throat tight, speaking about courage and self-worth, about the difference between being related to people and being family with them. She raised her glass to Jake, who had learned that lesson earlier and harder than most, and everyone cheered. Jake checked his phone once during dessert. 17 missed calls, dozens of texts from his parents, each one angrier than the last. They blamed him for ruining their weekend, for being selfish, for forcing them to choose. Ashley had sent a single message, "Hope you're happy." His father's final text read, "Don't bother coming home tonight." Jake silenced his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Sophie squeezed his hand under the table. Marcus was already telling an embarrassing story from their freshman year. Aunt Linda caught his eye and nodded, understanding everything in that single gesture. Jake picked up his fork and returned to his tiramisu, surrounded by people who had chosen to be there, celebrating an achievement that was his alone. The empty chairs where his parents should have been hurt less than he expected. Some absences, he was learning, felt more like freedom than loss. The house felt like enemy territory when Jake finally returned Sunday afternoon. His parents' cars sat in the driveway like sentries, and he steeled himself before opening the front door. The silence that greeted him was different from the usual quiet. It was loaded, weaponized, a living thing that pressed against his skin. His mother stood in the kitchen, her back to him, washing dishes with aggressive precision. His father sat in the living room, newspaper raised like a shield, though Jake could see his eyes weren't moving across the text. The silent treatment lasted exactly 2 days before it exploded into something worse. Tuesday evening, his mother cornered him as he prepared dinner, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. How could he have been so selfish? How could he have lied about the graduation date? The accusation was so absurd that Jake actually laughed, a short, bitter sound that made his mother's face flush darker. He pulled out his phone, scrolling back through months of messages, showing her the calendar invites, the dinner reminders, the explicit conversations about May 18th. She barely glanced at the screen before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. Those messages didn't prove anything. Maybe he had mentioned it, but he certainly hadn't emphasized how important it was. If he had really wanted them there, he would have made it clearer. The gaslighting was so blatant, so shameless, that Jake felt something fundamental shift inside him. He had spent years trying to understand his parents' behavior, making excuses for their favoritism, believing that if he just communicated better or tried harder, things would change. Now he saw the truth with crystalline clarity. They would never admit fault, never acknowledge their role in this dysfunction, because doing so would require examining their treatment of him over the past 22 years. His father joined the argument, his voice booming through the house about respect and gratitude. Jake had lived under their roof rent-free, eaten their food, used their utilities. The least he could do was help with his sister's children when needed. The fact that Jake had worked 2 jobs throughout college, that he had paid for his own education while they funded Ashley's entirely, that he had contributed to groceries and household expenses, none of that mattered in his father's narrative. In their version of events, Jake was the ungrateful son who had abandoned his family for a meaningless ceremony. Ashley's texts began arriving that evening, cold and cutting. She had returned from her retreat refreshed and reconnected with Brad, only to hear about Jake's tantrum and how he had forced their parents to miss his graduation. The revisionist history was stunning. Somehow, in Ashley's mind, Jake's refusal to babysit had become Jake's fault that their parents chose babysitting over graduation. The logic was twisted, but it was also familiar. Ashley had never been held accountable for anything in her life, so why would this be different? Jake stopped responding to the family group chat. He spent his evenings in his room, door closed, scrolling through apartment listings with renewed urgency. The job offer he had accepted came with a start date 3 weeks away, and he began planning his exit strategy with military precision. He reached out to Aunt Linda, who offered to help with moving costs. Marcus volunteered his truck and his Saturday. Sophie started collecting boxes from her retail job, stacking them in her apartment for when Jake needed them. The apartment he finally chose was small, a one-bedroom on the third floor of an older building with questionable plumbing but good natural light. The rent was higher than he wanted to pay, but it was available immediately, and Jake was willing to eat ramen for months if it meant escaping the toxic atmosphere at home. He signed the lease on a Thursday, using his graduation money from Aunt Linda for the security deposit, and set his move-out date for the following Saturday. He didn't tell his parents until Friday night, 3 weeks and 2 days after graduation. The announcement was simple and direct, delivered over dinner with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. He had found an apartment and would be moving out tomorrow. His mother's fork clattered against her plate. His father's face went through several shades of red before settling on purple. The explosion was immediate and predictable. They couldn't believe his ingratitude. After everything they had done for him, this was how he repaid them. His mother's voice climbed into registers usually reserved for genuine emergencies. His father demanded to know how Jake thought he could afford to live on his own, implying that he would come crawling back within months, broke and humiliated. Neither of them seemed to register that Jake had been essentially living on his own financially for 4 years, that their support had consisted primarily of a bedroom and occasional groceries. The attempted reconciliation came Saturday morning, just as Marcus pulled up with his truck. His mother appeared in Jake's doorway, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice soft and wounded. Maybe they had all overreacted. Maybe they could talk about this, work something out. His father stood behind her, not apologizing but not actively hostile either. His presence meant to signal a willingness to negotiate. It felt hollow, performative, a last-ditch effort to maintain control rather than a genuine desire to repair the relationship. Jake kept packing. He thanked them for letting him stay as long as they had, his tone polite but distant, treating them like landlords rather than parents. The boxes accumulated in the hallway, his books, his clothes, his laptop, the few possessions he had accumulated over 22 years. It was remarkable how little space a life took up when you had never been given room to expand. Aunt Linda arrived as they were loading the last boxes, bringing coffee and donuts and a fierce hug that Jake sank into gratefully. His mother watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. His father had retreated to the garage, unable or unwilling to witness his son's departure. Ashley sent a text as Jake was doing a final sweep of his room. Running away won't solve anything. He deleted it without responding. The new apartment smelled like fresh paint and other people's lives. Jake's furniture was minimal: a mattress, a small desk, a lamp, some kitchen supplies Sophie had collected from thrift stores. But as he stood in the empty living room, watching Marcus and Aunt Linda arrange his few belongings, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. The silence here was different from the silence at his parents' house. It wasn't loaded with expectation or resentment. It was just silence, neutral and clean, waiting to be filled with whatever life he chose to build. That first night, Jake ordered pizza and sat on his mattress on the floor, eating straight from the box while scrolling through his phone. His parents hadn't called. Ashley had sent one more text, asking if he was really going through with this, as if moving out was a bluff rather than a decision. He turned off his phone and looked around his small apartment, at the boxes still waiting to be unpacked, at the blank walls that would soon hold his own choices for decoration, at the door that locked from the inside and kept out everyone he didn't explicitly invite in. The first babysitting request came exactly 1 week. After Jake moved out, a text from Ashley at 9 p.m. on a Friday. Emergency. Need you to watch the kids tomorrow morning. Brad's mom fell. Jake stared at the message for a long moment, recognizing the familiar panic-inducing framing, the assumption that his Saturday was available, the lack of actual question marks. He typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on the simplest truth. Sorry to hear about Brad's mom. I'm not available tomorrow, but I can schedule time with the kids next weekend if you'd like. The response was immediate and furious. How could he be so cold? This was a family emergency. What was he doing that was more important than helping his sister? Jake didn't respond. He had learned in therapy. He'd started seeing someone 2 weeks after moving out, that he didn't owe explanations for his boundaries. The next morning, Ashley posted on social media about finding a last-minute babysitter, her tone martyred but managing. Jake felt a twinge of guilt, then reminded himself that Ashley had 3 children by choice and a husband who could presumably help arrange childcare. The pattern repeated itself over the following months with decreasing frequency. Each request was met with the same response. He wasn't available for last-minute needs, but he was happy to schedule time with his nieces and nephew in advance. Sometimes Ashley accepted, sometimes she didn't respond at all. Slowly, painfully, a new normal emerged. Jake visited every other Sunday afternoon, taking the kids to the park or the library, giving Ashley a few hours of predictable, scheduled relief. The children adjusted quickly, their resilience a reminder that they had never been as fragile as Ashley claimed. Extended family members began reaching out privately, conversations that revealed years of observation Jake hadn't known existed. His cousin Michelle called one evening, admitting she had always noticed the favoritism, but hadn't known how to address it. Uncle Tom mentioned over coffee that he'd argued with Jake's father about the graduation situation, a fight that had ended with Tom being uninvited from a family barbecue. Even Brad's sister reached out, sharing that she'd witnessed Ashley's manipulation tactics and felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. The validation was healing but also infuriating. Jake struggled with the knowledge that so many people had seen his family's dysfunction but remained silent, prioritizing their own comfort over his well-being. His therapist helped him process the anger, reminding him that other people's failures didn't diminish his courage in finally setting boundaries. Still, Jake found himself pulling back from extended family gatherings, attending only major holidays and keeping visits brief. His mother's call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 5 months after graduation. Jake almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Her voice was careful, measured, lacking the usual edge of accusation. She wanted to talk, she said, really talk. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between his apartment and his childhood home, both of them arriving exactly on time in a way that felt symbolic. The apology, when it came, was partial and painful. His mother admitted she should have made it to graduation, that it was an important milestone she had missed. But in the next breath, she defended the overall situation. Ashley had needed them. The children came first. Family meant sacrifice. Jake listened without interrupting, recognizing that this was likely the best apology he would receive. His mother was incapable of examining the deeper patterns, the years of favoritism that had led to that single missed ceremony. He accepted the apology for what it was, incomplete but genuine within her limited capacity for self-reflection. He didn't back down on his boundaries, though. He explained calmly that he would continue to maintain his schedule, that last-minute requests wouldn't work, that he needed advance notice and respect for his time. His mother's face tightened, but she nodded. It wasn't the warm reconciliation either of them had probably imagined, but it was honest. Ashley's separate outreach came as a genuine surprise. She asked to meet for lunch, just the two of them, and arrived looking tired in a way that seemed deeper than simple exhaustion. Her apology was different from their mother's, more specific, more aware. She admitted she had taken Jake for granted, had used him as free childcare without considering his own life and needs. She talked about her own therapy, about recognizing patterns she'd learned from their parents, about trying to break cycles before her children internalized them. Jake wanted to stay angry, to hold onto his resentment as protection. But watching his sister cry genuine tears, hearing her acknowledge specific instances of manipulation, he felt something shift. Forgiveness, he was learning, didn't mean forgetting or accepting past behavior. It meant choosing whether to allow someone access to your future. Ashley was trying, actually trying, in ways their parents likely never would. Over the following months, Ashley began hiring actual babysitters, teenage neighbors and college students who needed the work. She stopped sending last-minute texts and started asking Jake weeks in advance if he wanted to spend time with the kids. When he said no, she accepted it without guilt trips. When he said yes, she respected his time limits and didn't try to extend visits. It was a small miracle, this new dynamic, built on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. The family slowly rebuilt itself on new terms. Jake attended Thanksgiving and Christmas, arriving when he said he would and leaving when he was ready, no longer trapped by expectations or guilt. His parents remained somewhat distant, unable to fully bridge the gap their favoritism had created, but they were civil. Ashley's children grew comfortable with their uncles. Boundaries, learning that love didn't require constant availability. Jake's own life flourished in the space he'd created. His job challenged him in ways that felt meaningful. His apartment, though small, became a sanctuary he decorated with care. His relationship with Sophie deepened into something solid and healthy, built on mutual support rather than codependency. He started a hobby he'd always wanted to try, pottery classes on Wednesday evenings, and discovered he was terrible at it but loved it anyway. One evening in December, sitting in his apartment with Sophie curled beside him on the couch they'd found at an estate sale, Jake reflected on the past year. His graduation photo sat on the bookshelf, Aunt Linda and Marcus and Sophie grinning beside him. The absence of his parents no longer the first thing he noticed when he looked at it. He thought about the person he'd been a year ago, so desperate for his family's approval that he'd nearly sacrificed his own milestone for it. The journey hadn't been easy. There were still moments when he questioned his choices, when he wondered if he'd been too harsh or too rigid. But then he'd remember the peace he felt in his own space, the relationships he'd built with people who chose to show up for him, the self-respect that came from finally prioritizing his own needs. He'd learned that family wasn't just about blood or obligation. It was about mutual respect, consistent support, and the willingness to celebrate each other's achievements without resentment. Jake picked up his phone and scrolled to a photo from last weekend. Emma, Tyler, and Sophia at the park, their faces bright with laughter as they played on the swings. He'd spent 2 scheduled hours with them, then gone home to his own life without guilt. Ashley had texted afterward, "Thank you for being their uncle. I'm glad you're in their lives on your terms." That message, more than any apology or reconciliation, felt like victory. Jake was building a life on his own terms, maintaining relationships that honored his boundaries, and teaching his nieces and nephew through example that self-respect wasn't selfish. It was essential. He'd never get back the years he'd lost to people-pleasing and misplaced obligation, but he had something better, a future where his choices were his own, his achievements were celebrated, and his worth wasn't measured by his willingness to sacrifice himself for others' convenience.